The late afternoon sun, a relentless, bleached orange, poured through the grimy kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the heavy, still air. It was 1987, and the town of Weirich Creek felt as though it had been baking under this same sun for 100 years, slowly crumbling into the red earth that perpetually coated everything. The heat, even now, clung to the corrugated iron roof of Arthur's house, radiating a dry, inescapable warmth. He sat at the scarred laminate table, a chipped enamel mug of cooling tea before him, the silence of the house pressing in around him like a physical weight. The only sounds were the distant, mournful creak of the wind vane on the old shed, a rusty lament carried on the faintest breeze, and the persistent, irritating buzz of a fly trapped somewhere near the ceiling, its futile struggle a tiny, maddening counterpoint to the quiet. His gaze, tired and unfocused, drifted to a small, framed drawing propped against a stack of outdated newspapers by the window. The papers, brittle with age, proclaimed headlines from months, perhaps a year, ago, their news long irrelevant. The drawing, however, still held a quiet power. It was a charcoal sketch of the old water tower, the town's most prominent landmark, rendered with a youthful, eager hand, its lines surprisingly confident for a child's work. Sarah had drawn it when she was 12, nearly 15 years ago. He remembered the day she'd brought it home, carefully, almost reverently, before he'd dismissed it. Now, in the oppressive quiet, he reached out, his calloused thumb tracing the faint, smudged signature in the corner. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through his hand, a ripple of something he couldn't quite name. The paper felt thin, fragile, like the memory it held, ready to tear if held too tightly, or fade if not cherished. The air shifted, cool and sharp, and suddenly it was 1978. Sarah, a whirlwind of gangly limbs and bright, boundless curiosity, burst into the small, dusty living room, her school bag slung carelessly over one shoulder, nearly knocking over a stack of old magazines. "Dad, look what Miss Davies said," she exclaimed, her voice high with excitement, thrusting a crumpled piece of paper at him as if it were a treasure map. Arthur, then 45, was hunched over the kitchen bench, the space between the living room and kitchen barely a doorway, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to coax life back into a recalcitrant radio. Grease stained his hands and smeared the front of his worn work shirt, a permanent fixture of his days. The smell of oil and dust always seemed to cling to him. He glanced up, his eyes, usually sharp and discerning when examining engine parts or checking the pressure gauge on the pump, seemed to slide over the drawing of a lopsided gum tree, its branches reaching awkwardly towards a smudged sun. It wasn't the water tower, not yet. "That's nice, love," he mumbled, his attention already drifting back to the radio's innards, a tangle of wires and circuit boards that defied his logic. He jiggled a loose connection. "Did you finish your sums?" Sarah's shoulders slumped, the light in her eyes dimming just a fraction, like a bulb losing power. Her smile, so bright a moment ago, faltered. She held the drawing a little less proudly, her fingers tightening around the edges. She didn't say anything, just looked down at the floor, a small sigh escaping her lips. Helen, Arthur's wife, emerged from the bedroom, her gentle face etched with a familiar weariness that wasn't quite sadness, but a deep-seated understanding of how things were. She carried a basket of clean, folded laundry. She saw Sarah's downturned face, and then the drawing. "Arthur, look at it properly," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's very good." She moved towards Sarah, a comforting hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. Arthur sighed, a sound of mild exasperation, and wiped a hand on his trousers, leaving another faint grease mark. He took the drawing, holding it at arm's length as if it might bite him, and gave a perfunctory nod. It's a tree. Good. Now, this radio won't fix itself." He handed it back to Sarah without really looking at her. He didn't see the tiny spark of hope that had briefly flickered in her eyes, only to be snuffed out again. Sarah retreated to her room, the door clicking shut with a quiet finality that spoke volumes of disappointment. The sound was small, but it echoed in the sudden quiet of the house. Helen caught Arthur's eye, a silent plea passing between them, a long-practiced communication of concern and frustration. He met her gaze for a moment, then merely shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture that closed off the conversation. He was already lost again in the logic of wires and circuits, the tangible problems of the world far more compelling than the intangible dreams of his daughter. Helen watched him for another moment, then sighed, a heavier sound than Sarah's, and continued with her laundry, the soft rustle of fabric filling the void. By 1981, Sarah was 15, and her artistic inclinations had blossomed from childhood enthusiasm into a fierce, almost desperate desire to escape. The air in Weirich Creek felt heavy, not just with the perpetual dust, but with unspoken futures, with the crushing weight of expectation and the lack of opportunity. She spent hours in her room, charcoal smudged on her fingers, sketching the desolate beauty of the land, the crumbling fences, the defiant wildflowers, and always, the water tower, a silent sentinel watching over their small, forgotten town. She saw not just lines and shadows, but possibilities beyond the red earth. One sweltering evening, the kind where the air hung thick and humid even after the sun had dipped below the horizon, the family ate a silent dinner of chops and boiled potatoes. The only sound was the clinking of cutlery against ceramic, punctuated by the occasional buzz of a fly that had somehow found its way inside. Sarah pushed her plate away, the half-eaten chop a testament to her churning stomach. She took a deep breath, her heart thudding against her ribs. "Mum, Dad, I've been looking at brochures," she began, her voice tentative but firm, carefully enunciating each word. "There's an art college in Perth. They have a foundation course." Arthur slowly, deliberately, put down his fork, the clink echoing in the quiet room, amplifying the sudden tension. He looked at her, his expression unreadable at first, then hardening. "Perth?" he scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound that seemed to shrivel the air around them. "That's a world away, lass. And for what? To draw pictures?" He picked up his fork again, but didn't resume eating, merely held it, poised. Helen reached across the table, her hand resting on Sarah's arm, a small, comforting pressure. "It's a proper college, Arthur." The framed drawing of the water tower, once a beacon of Sarah's untamed spirit, felt thin and fragile in Arthur's hand. The paper, softened with age, had absorbed the warmth of his grip, a ghost of the girl who had pressed crayon to its surface so many years ago. 2 years had passed since Helen's sudden, quiet departure, and the silence in the house had deepened, settling into the very bones of the structure, echoing in every empty room. It wasn't just Helen's voice that was gone, it was the soft rustle of her movements, the clink of her teacup, the knowing glance she'd cast his way when Sarah's name came up. He set the drawing down on the polished surface of the old sideboard, a faint film of dust disturbed by its landing. He walked slowly to the old rotary phone on the hall table. It sat there, an anachronism in a house full of fading memories, its beige plastic yellowed by time. His fingers, calloused from years of gripping tools and rock drills, hovered over the dial, tracing the smooth, cool surface without making contact. Sarah's number, scrawled on a greasy napkin from the local takeaway, lay beneath the phone, a testament to a connection he hadn't nurtured. He hadn't spoken to her in months, not since Mark, her husband, had finally found steady work in a town 3 hours away, pulling Sarah and their little boy further into the vast, indifferent landscape. The distance wasn't just geographical, it felt like an ocean. What would he say? The words felt hollow, inadequate, even before they formed. "Hello, love, just checking in?" It sounded like a stranger's inquiry, a perfunctory gesture devoid of the true feeling that churned in his gut. He imagined her voice, perhaps tired, perhaps polite, certainly distant. He couldn't bear the thought of that practiced politeness, the wall he knew she had built around herself. He turned away from the phone, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He paced the small living room, the familiar worn rug under his feet offering a faint comfort. Each step seemed to echo in the emptiness. The house, once filled with the muted hum of family life, now felt too big, too cavernous for one man. He missed Helen's gentle presence, her quiet understanding that had often spoken volumes without a single word. He missed the life that could have been, the vibrant, noisy, messy life he had inadvertently stolen from his daughter, piece by painstaking piece. He saw Helen's face in his mind, her eyes, always so quick to soften for Sarah, now held a silent accusation that he couldn't shake. She had seen it all, hadn't she? Every quiet withdrawal, every suppressed sigh, every flicker of light in Sarah's eyes that he had, in his stubbornness, extinguished. He stepped outside onto the veranda, the evening air still warm, carrying the distinct, dry scent of eucalyptus. The town was a collection of dim, scattered lights against the vast, star-dusted sky, a sprawling canvas of isolation. Across the street, old Mr. Henderson, his face crinkled with laughter lines, was sharing a joke with his grown son, who had returned from the city to help with the farm. The sound of their easy camaraderie, their shared history, drifted across the quiet street. A sharp pang, almost physical, shot through Arthur's chest, a sudden, brutal ache of recognition. He had missed that. He had chosen to miss that, trading it for what he'd convinced himself was duty, for the hard, unyielding practicality of Weir Creek. The thought settled in his mind like a stone, heavy and cold. A few days later, Arthur found himself at the general store, a place that felt both familiar and utterly alien. A new family ran it now, their faces unfamiliar, their movements quicker, more efficient than the old proprietors. He was buying milk and bread, the mundane necessities of a solitary life. The familiar creak of the floorboards under his boots was a ghost of Sarah's presence, a phantom sound he almost expected to be followed by her quiet, "Can I help you, Dad?" He remembered the way she'd moved behind the counter, her smile for customers a practiced, empty thing, her eyes holding a distant sadness. As he waited at the counter, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair walked in, her gaze sweeping the shelves with a mixture of nostalgia and mild surprise. It was Mrs. Peterson, Sarah's old art teacher, who had moved away years ago to live closer to her own children and was just visiting for a week. Her eyes, still sharp behind her spectacles, landed on Arthur. "Arthur, goodness, is that you?" she exclaimed, her voice carrying a warmth that felt out of place in the quiet store. They exchanged pleasantries, the small talk about the changes in Weir Creek a thin veil over the years that had passed. The mine closure, the families who had left, the slow, creeping quiet that had settled over the town. Arthur offered clipped, factual answers, his gaze fixed on a display of tinned peaches. Then, her eyes softened, a thoughtful, wistful note entering her voice. "I often wonder about Sarah," she said, almost to herself. "Such a talented girl. I always thought she had a real gift." Arthur's hand, resting on the counter, tightened almost imperceptibly. He mumbled something about her being fine. "She sent me a postcard once," Mrs. Peterson continued, oblivious to his discomfort, "from Brisbane, years ago. A little watercolor of the Story Bridge, beautifully done. Said she was taking evening classes, just for herself. Such a shame she couldn't pursue it properly." The words hung in the air, a gentle, unintentional indictment. Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his chest, a sudden, sickening lurch. Brisbane, evening classes. The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't known. He had never asked. The sheer, crushing weight of his ignorance descended upon him. He had been so certain of his wisdom, of his practical foresight, that he had never bothered to look beyond his own narrow view, never bothered to ask what small, defiant acts of rebellion Sarah was performing to keep her spirit alive. He mumbled something non-committal, a half-formed grunt, paid for his groceries with fumbling hands, and left the store, the weight of his unasked questions, of his unacknowledged daughter, a crushing burden. The milk and bread in his bag felt heavy, insubstantial compared to the leaden feeling in his gut. Later that week, the old Holden ute, its engine groaning in protest, kicked up a plume of red dust as Arthur drove out to the old cemetery. The familiar track, rutted and uneven, led him past scrubby bushland and silent, empty paddocks. He pulled up beside the rusted wire fence and got out, the afternoon sun beating down, relentless and unforgiving. He stood before Helen's simple headstone, the granite warm beneath his fingers, almost humming with the stored heat of the day. The sun beat down, radiating off the dry earth, but he didn't feel the heat, not truly. His own internal landscape was too stark, too cold for anything else to penetrate. "Helen," he whispered, his voice cracking, raw with a grief that had been too long held captive. "I messed up, didn't I? I should have let her go. Should have seen what she needed. You told me. You always knew." The words tumbled out, a confession years overdue, a bitter acknowledgement of his own blindness. He remembered her quiet sighs, her lingering gazes, her gentle suggestions that he had always brushed aside with a gruff practicality he now saw as nothing more than fear. He knelt, his knees protesting with a dull ache, the dry earth cool beneath his trousers. He ran his hand over the carved letters of her name, the granite smooth and unyielding. Tears, hot and unexpected, pricked his eyes, then spilled over, tracing paths through the dust on his cheeks. He hadn't cried since her funeral, not a single tear. The grief had been a hard, dry thing then, a stone in his chest. But now, it was a torrent, a release of all the unspoken words, all the missed chances, all the love he had failed to show, and the life he had inadvertently broken. He stayed there, head bowed, the sound of his own ragged sobs swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the bush. The wind, a dry, persistent whisper, carried the scent of dust and distant eucalypts through the cemetery. Arthur stood by the simple headstone, the granite cool beneath his fingertips. "I was so worried about keeping her safe, keeping her close," he continued, his voice barely audible, a raw rasp against the vast, empty space. He wasn't speaking to Helen's memory, not entirely. He was speaking to the silence, to the decades of his own making. "But I broke her, didn't I? I see it now. All these years. She was never happy here. Never." The words hung in the still air, heavy and unbidden, a confession offered without expectation of absolution. Only the rustle of dry leaves and the distant call of a magpie answered him, offering no comfort, just the stark, unyielding truth. Back at the house, the quiet seemed to press in on him, amplifying the echo of his own words. A sudden, almost frantic urge propelled him towards Sarah's old room, a space frozen in time, untouched since she had packed her small bag and walked out, years ago. He pushed the door open, the faint creak startling in the stillness. The air inside was thick with the scent of stale mothballs and forgotten dreams, a poignant cocktail that tightened his chest. He moved to the wardrobe, its wooden doors stiff as he pulled them apart. Inside, neat rows of clothes she'd outgrown still hung, ghostly reminders. His gaze lifted to the top shelf, where, tucked away behind some old blankets, was a dusty cardboard box. Sarah's art supplies, a childish hand had scrawled on the side in faded blue crayon. His heart gave a painful lurch. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against the rough cardboard, a tremor running through him. He pulled it down, the dust motes dancing in the shaft of afternoon light that pierced the window. He carried the box to her old desk, a scarred pine surface where she'd once done her homework, her head bent in concentration. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst dried-up tubes of paint and brittle, stiffened brushes, were dozens of drawings. Sketches of Weirich Creek, yes, but seen through Sarah's unique, vibrant lens. The dusty main street transformed into a chiaroscuro of light and shadow, the old pub a riot of warm yellows and deep reds. Abstracts swirled with colors he'd never seen in their landscape, portraits of townspeople captured with a sensitivity that made their familiar faces suddenly unfamiliar, profound. Landscapes that transformed the mundane into something magical, a lonely gum tree on the horizon rendered with a majesty he'd never noticed. Each drawing was a fresh revelation, a window into a world he had steadfastly refused to see. And at the very bottom, beneath the last vibrant sketch of the old water tower, a small, leather-bound journal. His fingers, still trembling, picked it up. The leather was soft, worn smooth in places from countless hours of handling. He opened it, the pages brittle with age. Her adolescent handwriting filled the pages, neat yet passionate, documenting her dreams, her frustrations, her quiet despair after he'd refused her, after he'd told her to put away her nonsense. He read, his eyes scanning the familiar loops and flourishes, each word a fresh wound. Dad doesn't understand. He just sees the dust and the hard work. He doesn't see the colors. Another entry, dated weeks later, he said I was wasting my time. Said I should focus on what's real. But this is real. More real than anything. He read on, the pages turning with a soft rustle, each sentence a stark reminder of the brilliant, sensitive girl he had inadvertently crushed. A girl whose world was so much richer, so much more vivid than his own. He saw the talent, the burning passion, the deep desire that he had so carelessly dismissed as nonsense, as a frivolous distraction from the harsh realities of life. The quiet regret that had been a dull ache within him for years was no longer quiet. It roared through him, a desolate wind in an empty landscape, tearing at the foundations of his self-perception. The next morning, the kitchen felt different. Arthur sat at his kitchen table, not with his usual mug of tea, but with a cheap bureau and a blank sheet of paper, its stark white unforgiving under the fluorescent light. He had spent the night poring over Sarah's journal, the words echoing in his mind, Helen's quiet wisdom now a guiding light in the dark labyrinth of his thoughts. He didn't know what to write, how to even begin to articulate the decades of unspoken regret, the raw, aching truth that had finally broken through his hardened shell. His hand, usually steady from years of manual labor, shook as he scrawled, "My dearest Sarah," across the top of the page, the ink bleeding slightly into the paper. He paused, staring at the words, a lump forming in his throat. He wasn't good with words. He was a man of action, of fixing things, of tangible labor, of earth and sweat and steel. But this was a different kind of brokenness, a wound that no amount of fixing could mend, only honesty could soothe. He took a deep breath, the smell of old coffee still clinging to the air. He wrote about the water tower drawing, about how he still had it, tucked away in his own drawer, about the way the light hit it just so in the afternoon, making the old rust glow like copper. He wrote about Helen, about her quiet wisdom, about how she had tried to tell him, in her gentle way, to see Sarah for who she was, not who he wanted her to be. He didn't apologize directly, not yet. The word felt too small, too inadequate for the chasm he had created. Instead, he wrote about his fears for her, his misguided attempts to keep her safe from the harshness of a life he knew too well, and the terrible, gut-wrenching realization that in trying to protect her, he had only hurt her. He wrote about the mine, the town, the way everything had changed, the dust settling heavier now, the colors fading. He didn't know where she was, but he wrote the letter anyway, a desperate outpouring of a father's burdened heart, a fragile attempt to bridge the unbridgeable. He folded it carefully, his fingers fumbling with the creases, and placed it in a plain white envelope, addressing it to her old address, the one she'd left behind when she married Mark, hoping against all odds that someone, somewhere, would forward it. It was a small, fragile gesture, but it was a start, a single, tentative step into the vast unknown. He spent the next few days in a quiet flurry of activity, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years stirring within him. He called the old post office in the town Mark had moved to, the crackle of the phone line a faint connection to a distant past. Then he called the new one, his voice surprisingly steady as he explained his search, the words coming out more easily than he expected. He spoke to distant relatives he hadn't contacted in years, their voices surprised, then softening with a hint of understanding as he laid bare his quest. Slowly, painstakingly, the pieces came together. He found out Sarah and Mark had moved again, further north, to a coastal town called Port Hedland, where Mark had found work on the docks. The distance was immense, a long drive, nearly 2 days, across vast, empty stretches of land, red dust giving way to sparse, scrubby bush. He packed a small bag, mostly practical clothes and a few of Helen's old photos. He filled his thermos with strong, black coffee, the bitter aroma of familiar comfort. He topped up the Utes' petrol tank, the gauge slowly rising to full. The old Holden coughed to life with a familiar grumble, spitting dust and loose gravel as he pulled out of the driveway, leaving Weirich Creek behind. Perhaps for good. The journey was arduous, the landscape slowly transforming from the deep, ancient reds of the interior to the lighter, sandier tones of the coast. He thought about Sarah, about her little boy he barely knew, a vague image from a faded photograph. He thought about what he would say, how he would look at her after all this time, after all the years of silence and his own stubborn pride. The regret was a constant companion, a heavy weight in his gut, but now, it was tinged with a fragile, almost unbearable hope, a flicker of light in the vast darkness. 2 days later, the Holden rattled into Port Headland, the sound of its engine lost amidst the industrial hum of the working port. The town was vibrant, bustling with the activity of cargo ships and heavy machinery, a stark contrast to the sleepy, decaying silence of Weirich Creek. The air here smelled of salt and diesel, a bracing, unfamiliar scent that filled his lungs. He followed the directions he'd painstakingly gathered, past rows of neat, modest houses, until he found the address. A small, neat house with a patch of struggling lawn, a testament to the harsh coastal sun. He parked the ute down the street, beneath the shade of a large gum tree, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of his anticipation. He saw a woman in the garden, her back to him, hanging clothes on a line. Her hair, a familiar shade of sun-streaked brown, was pulled back in a simple ponytail, a few strands escaping to catch the harsh sunlight like threads of gold. It was Sarah. She looked older, her frame a little wider, softened by time and motherhood, but there was a quiet strength in her movements, a grace he hadn't remembered. A small boy, perhaps 5 or 6, burst out of the house, clutching a brightly colored plastic truck, his bare feet slapping against the concrete path. "Mum, look," he shouted, his voice clear and joyful, brimming with the uncomplicated happiness of childhood. Sarah turned, a genuine, unburdened smile lighting her face as she bent down to her son, her hand gently ruffling his hair. Arthur watched, hidden by the shade of the gum tree, a silent, uninvited spectator. He saw the way she laughed, a sound he hadn't heard in years, full and free. He saw the easy affection she shared with her son, the way her gaze lingered on him, full of a deep, abiding love. He saw a mother, a woman who had built a life, a world, far away from the dust and his stifling expectations. He sat there for a long time, watching, observing the quiet rhythms of her new life. He saw Mark come home from work, his gait tired but his smile warm. He saw them share a brief, easy kiss, a natural gesture of intimacy. He saw a family, whole and self-contained, a tapestry woven with threads he had no part in. The words he had rehearsed during the long drive, the heartfelt apologies, the carefully constructed explanations, suddenly felt hollow, inadequate, like pebbles dropped into an ocean. What right did he have to disrupt this peace, this carefully constructed happiness? His regret was a heavy stone in his gut, but it was his alone, a burden he had to carry. He had made his choices, and Sarah had made hers, forged in the crucible of his decisions, tempered by his mistakes. He pulled the letter from his shirt pocket, the one he had painstakingly written, the ink still smelling faintly of his kitchen table. He looked at it, then at Sarah, laughing with her son, her head thrown back in pure joy. Slowly, deliberately, he tore the letter into small, neat pieces, letting the coastal wind carry them away like tiny, forgotten secrets, scattering them across the dry ground. He started the ute, the engine a low rumble in the quiet street, a sound that felt deafening in the stillness of his revelation. He drove past her house one last time, a fleeting glimpse of her turning to go inside, her son's hand clasped in hers. He didn't stop. He didn't call out. The regret was still there, a quiet, constant hum beneath the surface of his being, a deep, persistent ache. But it was no longer a burden he had to fix, a wrong he had to right. It was simply a part of him now, a testament to the choices made. The paths diverged, the lessons learned too late. He drove out of Port Headland, heading towards the endless highway that stretched into the setting sun, the sky painting itself in hues of orange and purple, a silent, beautiful farewell. He had faced his regret, and in doing so, had finally, truly, allowed his daughter to be free. The feeling that remained was not one of despair, but of a quiet, profound understanding, a warmth that settled in his chest, a bittersweet peace. How was the story today? I want to show you a memorable scene. If there's a moment that overlaps with my memory, the story of that time, the scenery in my memory that I used to go to often, I feel for someone I can't meet anymore. The small things that come to mind right now, please leave it as a detail. If you're curious about a story that's released at the same time every day, subscriptions and notification settings are very helpful in creating videos.